Great Britain is a country where the monarchy has reigned for centuries, though history remembers a moment when Britain was plunged into civil wars and even briefly became a republic. This event changed the country forever, and it was the English Revolution. The first half of the 17th century was a turbulent time for Great Britain. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless, her distant relative, the Scottish King James VI, became the next in line for the throne. In 1603, he was crowned King of England and Ireland as James I. The Stuart dynasty, which came to power, formed a union and united three crowns within one state. The three countries accepted James as the legitimate monarch. Nonetheless, his son Charles I, who ascended to the throne in 1625, soon stirred up opposition from a significant part of the state due to his ambitions and ventures. In 17th century Europe, a political trend was gaining strength: absolutism. This was a form of monarchical rule in which the power of the king or emperor was unlimited and concentrated solely in his hands. France, Spain, Habsburg Austria, and Denmark gradually adopted this form of governance. Charles I attempted to reform England's system of government in this manner and to limit the influence of Parliament. As early as 1629, at the start of his reign, Charles I even dissolved Parliament and began ruling alone, a period that lasted the next 11 years. This move generated strong discontent among the English nobility and middle class, as the traditions of parliamentary rule in England had taken root as far back as the early 13th century. The two-chamber parliament included aristocrats and wealthy townsfolk representing various professional guilds. After the dissolution of Parliament, they did not disappear from the country's political life, but instead turned against the king. The growing internal tension in the state was also influenced by the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648. England did not participate in the conflict on the battlefield, but King Charles financially and diplomatically supported his relative Frederick V, Elector of the Palatinate and King of Bohemia, who was married to Charles I's sister. Frederick's defeat resulted in significant financial losses for England. Moreover, the 30 Years' War weakened Europe's economy overall, which led to a substantial reduction in the crown's revenues. This forced the king to raise taxes and introduce new ones. The most infamous was the ship money tax, implemented in 1634. Initially, this tax was intended for coastal regions in emergencies, particularly for financing the construction and maintenance of the navy. Yet, Charles III began to extend its reach beyond coastal areas, a move that triggered widespread discontent. Additionally, there was significant ideological tension. Like his father, Charles I was a Protestant and supported the Protestant coalition during the 30 Years' War. Nevertheless, due to his marriage to the Catholic Henrietta Maria, daughter of the French king, Charles III held certain sympathies toward Catholics. This created suspicions that he might ally with them and even restore the influence of Catholicism, which both the Scots and the English feared. Charles I further undermined his own authority when he initiated internal conflicts with his subjects. He attempted to impose Anglican religious traditions on the Scots, and even started an armed conflict for this purpose, the so-called Bishops' Wars, 1639 to 1640. Due to his underestimation of the opposition, Charles I lost and was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Berwick. The lack of funds following his defeat in this internal war compelled Charles to summon Parliament again. The king did not wish to share his power but sought to legitimize the imposition of new taxes. But the parliamentarians demanded greater influence over state policy, so tensions between them and the monarch continued to grow. In October 1641, a rebellion broke out in Catholic Ireland due to the oppression of the local population in terms of religious and property rights. The rebels quickly seized significant territories, including County Ulster. Supporters of Parliament in England saw an opportunity in this. In November of that year, a coalition of Parliament seized the Tower of London, a key fortress housing the arsenal for royal forces and the regalia of the ruler. Fearing for his life, Charles the Wart left the capital and withdrew to the north of England. By January 1642, he responded to the rebels by seizing the arsenal in Hull, previously controlled by Parliament's forces. Both sides were now gathering strength for battle. though the king had to allocate some of his resources to suppressing the rebellion in Ireland, where he sent troops. The actions of the monarch's forces in Ireland were brutal, further diminishing his authority. Meanwhile, in August 1642, Charles raised his royal standard in Nottingham, declaring war on Parliament. This moment is considered the official start of the First English Civil War. The king rallied the royalists while Parliament had its own armed forces, known as the Roundheads. The aristocrats siding with the king wore long hair, while Parliament supporters wore it short, hence the name. Society became divided. Parliament had the support of the middle class, artisans, and merchants, although there were also many lords who chose to oppose the king. The first major battle of the English Civil War took place on October 23, 1642, near the village of Edgehill in Warwickshire. The Royalists fought under the command of Charles III himself and his commander-in-chief, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's nephew and a distinguished general. They had approximately 12,000 soldiers. The parliamentary army, led by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, numbered around 15,000 men. At the beginning of the battle, the cavalry led by Prince Rupert successfully attacked the left flank of the parliamentary forces, pushing back the enemy and scattering their troops. Yet due to a lack of discipline, the Royal Cavalry moved away from the main battlefield in pursuit of the retreating units. This allowed the parliamentary infantry to launch counterattacks and inflict serious losses on the royal forces in the center. While the Royal Cavalry was withdrawing to regroup, the parliamentary army managed to stabilize the situation and avoid a rout. The Battle of Edgehill ended without a clear victor. Both sides suffered significant losses. This so distressed Charles I that he refused to march to London to regain control of the capital, as Prince Rupert had suggested. Instead, the king returned to Oxford and regrouped there, replenishing his forces for further advances. Only after a week did he set out for the capital, capturing Brentford along the way. At the same time, he continued negotiations with civic and parliamentary delegations, but to no avail. The royal army was advancing and could soon attempt to storm London. At the same time, the king's indecision gave the rebels time to prepare well. Already on the outskirts of London, Charles III's forces encountered a significantly larger militia, and in the Battle of Turnham Green, the king was repelled. Charles III avoided a rout, but was forced to retreat back to Oxford for the winter. In April 1643, unsuccessful peace negotiations took place. The war continued indecisively. Only in July did significant developments occur when Prince Rupert captured Bristol. Although the Royalists controlled the capital, the southern and partially central regions of England by this time, the king had the advantage in resources. Powerful landowners were on his side. Therefore, although neither side had a significant advantage on the battlefield, the Royalists gradually advanced. In June, after the Battle of Roundway Down, they already controlled most of Yorkshire. However, Parliament began forming alliances that strengthened their position. One such agreement was the Solemn League and Covenant with the Scottish Covenanters, which provided for their military assistance in exchange for a promise of religious reforms. Charles I visited Bristol and laid siege to Gloucester, further up the River Severn. His plan to undermine the city walls failed due to heavy rain, and when Parliament's forces approached to lift the siege, Charles retreated to Sudeley Castle. The parliamentary army turned back to London and the king followed in pursuit. In September 1643, the Battle of Newbury took place, where the parliamentary army was able to halt the advance of the Royalists. All the same, once again, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. After suffering significant losses, the armies dispersed. Charles I first tried to break the deadlock, and in January 1644, convened Parliament in Oxford. At his call, some members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons did appear, but this did not resolve the contradictions between him and the monarchy. Charles III became disillusioned with the ineffectiveness of the assembly. In the following months, both sides of the conflict gathered their forces. In 1644, Charles III remained in the southern half of England, while Rupert went north to defend Newark-on-Trent and York, which were under threat from parliamentary forces bolstered by the Scottish Covenanters. Fighting also resumed in the south, where Charles I achieved victory in the Battle of Cropredy Bridge at the end of June. But on July 2nd, a significant event occurred in the north that overshadowed this success. the Battle of Marston Moor, which became one of the largest in this conflict. On the parliamentary side were the forces of Oliver Cromwell and General Thomas Fairfax, who were supported by the Scots who arrived from the north under a treaty. At this time, the Royalists were led by Prince Rupert. The battle took place in the area of Marston Moor near the city of York. Before the battle, the parliamentary army numbered about 28,000 soldiers, while the Royalists had approximately 18,000 troops. The battle began early in the morning when the Royalists attacked the flanks of the parliamentary army. Nonetheless, thanks to Cromwell's tactical understanding, the parliamentary forces were able to withstand the pressure and organized a counterattack. Cromwell utilized the maneuverability of his troops, who were better trained and more disciplined than the Royalists. An important moment was the use of Cromwell's cavalry, which, by flanking the Royalist positions, delivered a decisive blow. As a result, the Royalists suffered a significant defeat, and the battle ended in victory for the parliamentary forces. After the Battle of Marston Moor, the Royalists lost control of northern England, marking an important turning point in the war in favor of Parliament. This battle also allowed Oliver Cromwell to rise to prominence within the parliamentary coalition. His talent as a military commander, decisive actions on the battlefield, and authority transformed him from a previously little-known member of Parliament into one of the leaders of the movement. So far, he had not displaced the other leaders of Parliament. In particular, in the subsequent Battle of Lostwithiel, the forces of Charles I faced the Earl of Essex. Still, he lost the battle, although he managed to extricate his troops from encirclement and avoid complete defeat. In the Second Battle of Newbury in October 1644, he, along with the Earl of Manchester, forced the Royalist forces to retreat. This time, despite having significantly fewer soldiers, the Royalists also managed to avoid a rout, and in the aftermath, Cromwell, due to his successes in the war, began to overshadow the Earl of Essex in his role as commander of the parliamentary forces. It is important to note that Cromwell was a Puritan, a representative of a group of Protestants who advocated for the removal of the last remnants of Catholicism from Anglicanism. In practice, this manifested as intolerance towards any other confessions and even denominations, as well as attempts to impose overly strict moral standards, asceticism, and ideological rigidity on society. Despite this, it was Oliver Cromwell who worked on reforming the army, and as early as 1644 and by 1645, his efforts yielded a definitive result: the New Model Army. This army was distinguished by its discipline, organization, and successful tactical maneuvers. All of this was demonstrated during the Battle of Naseby in June 1645, where the Royalists under King Charles I suffered a devastating defeat. Prince Rupert once again attacked the flank of the opposing army, but the infantry of the Roundheads pressed against the flank of the king himself. Charles IV wanted to rally his troops and stepped forward, but one of the loyal lords seized the reins of his horse, fearing for the monarch's safety. This was visible from a distance, and the king's forces mistakenly interpreted it as a command to retreat. Chaos ensued, culminating in a collapse by the hands of the parliamentary forces commanded by Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax. Fairfax was another leader of the parliamentary forces who assisted in the formation of the New Model Army and proved himself to be an outstanding military commander. Although he was a lord and of aristocratic descent, he fought devotedly for Parliament. Their victory, together with Cromwell, became a decisive moment in the war, as it allowed Parliament to establish control over most of England. After Naseby, Cromwell continued to pursue the remnants of the Royalist forces, enabling the parliamentary troops to consolidate their positions. In particular, he distinguished himself by defeating the Royalists under Lord Goring in the Battle of Langport in 1646. The war was nearing its conclusion as Fairfax's forces laid siege to the King's army in Oxford. Charles III had fled, disguising himself as a servant. He decided to surrender to the Scottish allies of Parliament, hoping that he could persuade them to switch their allegiance to his side. This idea failed. After 9 months of negotiations, the Scots finally reached an agreement with the English Parliament. In exchange for $100,000 and a promise of more money in the future, they handed over Charles to parliamentary commissioners in January 1647. The First Civil War ended in victory for Parliament, but England's future remained uncertain, leading to further conflicts. Initially, Charles I was placed under house arrest at Holdenby House in Northamptonshire. Meanwhile, a conflict arose between Parliament and the new model army. Parliament was willing to compromise, unlike the more radical members led by Cromwell. They removed the monarch and took him to Newmarket at his own suggestion, then transferred him to Oatlands and later to Hampton Court. Charles I did not grasp the seriousness of his situation and sought to exploit the divisions within his opposition by insisting on negotiations on his own terms. Predictably, this was unsuccessful. By November, he decided that it was in his best interest to escape, possibly to France, southern England, or Berwick-upon-Tweed, near the Scottish border. On November 11th, he fled from Hampton Court and from the shores of Southampton Water, contacted Colonel Robert Hammond, the parliamentary governor of the Isle of Wight. The king believed that the colonel would side with him, but he was mistaken again, as Hammond imprisoned Charles in Carisbrooke Castle and informed Parliament that the king was in custody. The king was removed from power but remained the legal sovereign of the state, and the parliamentary forces were unable to decide how to proceed. From Carisbrooke, Charles III continued to attempt to negotiate with various factions. On December 26, 1647, he signed a secret agreement with the Scots. According to the agreement, known as the Engagement, the Scots committed to invading England on behalf of Charles and restoring him to the throne on the condition that Presbyterianism be established in England for 3 years. All the same, Parliament received information about the king's plans and began preparing for a possible invasion. Radical elements, such as the Puritans led by Cromwell, advocated for severe punishment of the king, while other, less radical figures like Fairfax called for a compromise. The Royalists rose up in May 1648, igniting the Second Civil War. Uprisings began against the Roundheads in Kent, Essex, and Cumberland, as well as in South Wales. The Scots invaded to the south according to the agreement. Even though the Roundheads were prepared, and their new model army was highly effective, Cromwell suppressed the uprising of Royalist supporters in South Wales. On the first day of summer, the Battle of Maidstone took place, resulting in Fairfax quelling the rebellion in Kent. Immediately after, he moved to besiege the city of Colchester in Essex. The Royalist insurgents capitulated only after the city was gripped by hunger. One of the significant battles of the Second Civil War was the Battle of Preston in August 1648. The Royalist forces, primarily consisting of Scots led by the Duke of Hamilton, invaded England with the aim of restoring Charles I to power. Opposing them were the parliamentary forces commanded by Cromwell. The Scottish army numbered around 20,000 soldiers, but it was poorly organized and divided into several parts. Meanwhile, Cromwell, with a smaller force of approximately 9,000, exploited the enemy's weaknesses and managed to defeat the Scots in a series of fierce engagements. The decisive phase of the battle took place near Preston on August 17th, where Cromwell's forces attacked the poorly organized and coordinated Scottish units. The parliamentary troops managed to push back the Scots and encircle them. Over the next 2 days, Hamilton's army was completely defeated, with the remnants of the Scottish forces either surrendering or being destroyed. This event determined the outcome of the Second Civil War, as the Royalists could no longer turn the situation to their advantage. But they continued to try. In August 1648, Cromwell sent troops to finally suppress Royalist resistance. The Roundheads defeated the Loyalist Scots at the Battle of Winwick Pass, also known as the Battle of Red Bank in Cheshire. In November 1648, a desperate battle took place at Dartford, east of London. This region was strategically important for controlling access to the capital, due to its proximity to the River Thames. The parliamentary army quickly organized the defense of London and focused on fortified positions. When the Royalists approached Dartford, they were met by well-prepared troops. The fighting took place in urban terrain, where narrow streets and buildings complicated maneuvers for both sides. The Royalists were defeated. Thus, the only option left for Charles III was to return to negotiations, which were being held in Newport on the Isle of Wight. Moderate members of Parliament, particularly the Presbyterians, also began to advocate for negotiations with the king. On December 5, 1648, Parliament voted 129 to 83 in favor of continuing negotiations with the king, and peace seemed possible in the state. At the same time, Cromwell, at the head of radical military elements, staged a coup. This led to what became known as Pride's Purge, during which Colonel Thomas Pride, under orders from the army, expelled all supporters of negotiations with the king from Parliament. Thus, the radicals seized control of Parliament, and by January 1649, began the trial of Charles III. He was charged with treason against his people and abuse of power, as he had initiated the Civil War. The trial took place in Westminster Hall. Although the king attempted to challenge the legality of the court and defend himself, it bore no fruit. The outcome of the trial was evident even before it began, as Cromwell, with the help of the radicals and the military, controlled the proceedings. Charles III was found guilty and sentenced to death. The execution of Charles III took place on January 30th, 1649, in the square outside the Palace of Whitehall in London. This tragic event marked the end of the Second Civil War. Nonetheless, this new political order lasted for about 10 years and ultimately turned into a catastrophe for the country. Establishing order in the state proved impossible. Within a year of the Republic's establishment, the Third Civil War erupted, lasting from 1649 to 1651. Parliament was ineffective, divided into various factions that could not agree on actions. The country faced issues of inflation and unemployment that the government could not resolve. Cromwell exerted pressure on Parliament through his control of the army. He had already shown himself to be a ruthless tyrant when he led an extraordinarily bloody punitive expedition in Ireland in 1649. A serious threat to Cromwell came only from the son of the executed king, Charles II. In 1650, he was crowned King of Scotland in exchange for agreeing to establish a Presbyterian church in England and Scotland. The new king resolutely opposed Cromwell's seasoned and more numerous army, but on September 3, 1651, he was defeated at Worcester. He managed to escape abroad. Thomas Fairfax, disillusioned with the Republic, resigned from his position as commander of the army that same year. He withdrew from political life, and eventually, Cromwell consolidated all military power in his hands. As a result, in 1653, he dissolved Parliament entirely, entering the meeting hall with an armed escort. Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector of the state and seized power as a dictator. The imposition of Puritan moral standards, censorship restrictions on rights, economic crisis, a series of military conflicts abroad, and internal uprisings. All of these factors led to the situation where, after Cromwell's death in 1658, his son and successor Richard found himself without support and unable to maintain power. The Republican regime had never been popular, but due to Cromwell's tyranny, all strata of English society ultimately became disillusioned with it. As a result, the monarchy was restored. Charles II returned from exile, and on May 29, 1660, the people of London proclaimed him king. His official coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on April 23, 1661. Charles II skillfully avoided serious conflicts and even pardoned Fairfax, not pursuing the son of Oliver Cromwell. His moderate policies and cooperation with Parliament set England on the path to constitutional monarchy, a political regime that still exists in the country today.